The Order 1886 was a game I shouldn't have played on release. Everything being said about it before it came out was signaling that this would be the kind of game I would not enjoy, and lo and behold, I played it and I did not enjoy it. Shocker. It was quite literally being pitched as a film game. The focus wasn't on gameplay or even really story, to be honest, but on approximating the look of a movie. So it ran at a film-like 30 frames per second, had black cinema bars, and mechanically simplistic set pieces, riddled with QuickTime events. Maybe in and of itself there wasn't anything wrong with pursuing this style, but at the time, this approach came off especially offensive to me. We had just come out of the 7th gen, where by the end consoles like the PS3 and 360 had unfortunately settled on 30 frames per second as the performance standard. You know, if you were lucky. Prestige games were being lauded more and more for cinematic presentation and less for gameplay, and here comes a game wearing style over substance as almost a badge of honor. The Order was a PS4 exclusive published by Sony itself, and came out way before the PS4's most memorable games hit the scene. This was all the way back before Bloodborne, before Uncharted 4, before Yakuza 0, and before the ball really got rolling in 2017 and beyond. With the PS4 having about 3 exclusive games to its name in early 2015, and this being the next big thing from the publisher of the then biggest console, it felt like the Order was being pitched as what next-gen content should be like. But in the end, nobody needed me to point out that this was a misguided direction, because not many were having what the Order was cooking. Linear third-person shooter campaigns were all over the 7th gen consoles, and by the time the Order came out, the fatigue had set in. And it wasn't gonna change that, rocking up to the scene with 0 new mechanical twists on the formula. There's no active reload, like in Gears of War, or mantling walls and ledges, like in Uncharted. Here, it's pretty much the pure basics. You get your cover, and you get your 2 weapon slots. Occasionally you can go into rage mode and auto-target a bunch of guys in slow motion, and while it would have been derivative, I wonder why they didn't just bite the bullet time bullet and implement a system where you could freely move around in slow motion like a Vanquish, rather than just having this ability be a quick screen clearer. The gunplay isn't without its merits though. Some of these guns kick like a horse. When I cover shooters on this channel, I sometimes get comments criticizing me for aiming from the hip instead of always down the sights. And like, putting aside that there might be situations where you do just want to pop a shot off quickly, when I'm recording the game and maybe talking about visuals or a specific level, I want to get some footage where you can see the visuals from a wider shot and not just through a tiny hole. But also, sometimes I fire from the hip because it looks sick, and The Order is absolutely one of those games where it does. Some cool guns were of course not enough to make gamers champion the Order though, and if anything indicates that players were done with the simplistic, cover-based, third-person shooter campaigns of the late 2000s and early 2010s, it's the third-person shooting landscape of today, where all the big-budget third-person single-player shooters are in some shape or form survival games with more complex mechanics and very often some kind of horror element. And something I wonder when I replay The Order is, why wasn't this game a survival horror game? This title is obsessed with detailed, intricately designed environments, often in gloomy places where a supernatural evil may lurk. There are all these painstakingly crafted assets that you can peer over and inspect, and you'd think a better genre for all of this to shine would be a slower-paced, survival horror game where you more methodically explore and interact with the world, scour for resources and really take in the atmosphere, rather than blasting through it all Gears of War style. A slower, more methodical horror game pace would have probably also made the game longer than 5 hours. When I think survival horror, I also think replayability. I think about replaying the campaign to get a better time or score, and unlocking new costumes, weapons, and modes. The Order could have seriously done with anything in this department to give you a better reason for replaying than finding the odd missed audio log of a YouTube game essayist setting up for his first video review.
Right, is this contraption working? Right, no, I know, but yeah, alright, speaking to this thing, alright. Alright. Gotta get me speaking voice ready.
Everything is in place for this to be a horror game too. You play as basically the supernatural police in a monster-plagued late 19th century London. With its sad, morose, understated title screen track, you could be forgiven for thinking you just accidentally booted up some cult horror game, and not about to start a title where you're going to be defending a bridge on the back of a bus with a bazooka while being shouted at over intercom. But making The Order a survival horror game probably wouldn't have been in keeping with its filmic aspirations. It wants to have this filmic blockbuster aesthetic, and it was probably assumed that to create that look and feel, there needed to be massive shootouts and large-scale explosive action at consistent intervals. Not to mention, in 2015, third-person action shooters were still seen as a safer bet than survival horror games. Either way though, there are still some survival horror tropes in here that feel at odds with the core gameplay. Like you'll get through some big shootouts, but then be pushed into some gloomy room with a bunch of memos and photos to peer at that give further context as to what's going on in the world. And these sort of collectibles work better in a slow-paced game with more exploration weaved in between smaller scale enemy encounters peppered throughout a level, where the intense cat and mouse nature of the game's combat is alleviated by a rest inspecting some journal for a moment. I think it is worth assessing the actual quality of that filmic look the game puts so much focus on achieving though. And the fact is that, yeah, it's hard to deny that it achieves that look pretty well. The photorealistic assets, the considered use of motion blur, and the post-processing effects, and yes, even the black bars, do end up emulating the look of a movie well, giving you the impression almost that you're directing a character in a scene as you play. The environments having little bits and bobs that can go flying as you do battle also helps a lot to solidify this look, the kitchen fight obviously being a highlight in that department. I've softened on the musical score of the game as well. I mean, it's hard to criticize for what it is. It's a well-produced score trying to emulate a Hollywood score to complete the aesthetic, with a nice violin flair present throughout, which brings to mind the old-timey times. I mean, what did we really expect a game like this to go for? Vocal battle themes? Galahad, his mustache is twitching, better watch out, his gun's a bitchin'. What's grown on me more than the music, though, are the washed-out, almost monochrome colors the look of the game heavily favors. Now that I feel too many games have gone in the opposite direction, trying to be far too saturated and bloomy. I think the problem is the game could do with some tasteful sparks of color here and there to contrast that monochrome. Take Killzone 2 for example. Very dour looking game and rather monochromatic, but that overall grey and black world is usually punctuated by sharp splashes of piercing red and orange light, often thanks to the Helghast's helmets and machinery. It gives the game a more stylish and striking look. While here, even when multiple contrasting colors are presented, they all still remain fairly muted, with basically one color tone spread across the whole game. And it can sometimes get tiring to look at over the course of the title, even when, if taken in isolation, certain levels are complemented by that look, like the mellow sunset of the shipyard. All of this taken into account, maybe The Order could have delivered if the story had been a gripping tale that made it worthy of playing alone, but that didn't land either. The plot about this supernatural enforcer Galahad, who has to unravel a conspiracy in his own ranks, is a fine stage for a fun romp. But one of my main issues is said protagonist.
Nothing quite like a chilly London morning to stimulate the senses.
Galahad just isn't all that interesting.
Most fetching, was she not?
I hadn't noticed.
He's a stern, no-nonsense type who carries out his job diligently, and he doesn't really have a change of heart or develop much throughout the game. He simply ends up running afoul of his own side when investigating the conspiracy makes him look like a traitor. He's fine, he's not annoying, and he doesn't behave inconsistently. There's just not much to get invested in with him. Let's look at another franchise, not just lauded for its cinematic qualities, but also its characters. Uncharted. One big thing it has over The Order is a more fun and interesting protagonist. Nathan Drake is of course cheeky and can be a funny guy, but right off the bat, he's more interesting than someone like Galahad because he keeps you guessing. Drake is clearly a good guy with a good heart, but his treasure hunting adventures are evidently self-serving. What choices will he make as those two sides of his character play against each other? He's fun to be around, but as the kids say these days, there's a certain level of cope bubbling under the surface. He acts confident, but does he know what he wants? Is his next move going to be calculated, or is he just flying by the seat of his pants? Uncharted also knows that to hook an audience, it's also a good idea to start off with some action. I think it's good to start with a bang and not a slow plodding torture sequence before we know anything about anything, like in The Order. Uncharted also can suffer from that start and stop rhythm of big shootouts intercut with big rooms to walk around and look at things in. But it's undeniable that as you get more invested in the characters and world long term, you'll become more amiable to stopping and soaking that sort of stuff in. The Order never gets you into the characters enough to get you to that point, and the world also struggles to put its best foot forward, even though there was so much potential. I'd say too much of the story and setting is held back at arm's length. Oh, the Jack the Ripper murders? Those happened a few years ago, take our word for it. Oh, vampires are introduced? Sorry, you don't get to fight those. Oh, the guy who's ostensibly the main villain gets revealed? Sorry, maybe you'll get to face him in the next game that won't be made. What also hasn't been made is a PS5 patch for this game. Flaunt 30 FPS as an artistic choice all you want, but the reality is that the PS4 wouldn't have been able to output this game at 60 FPS anyway, but the PS5 absolutely could, and having that option would be great. Apparently, some people have gotten this to work, but it requires tinkering with your PS5 a bit. Honestly, while it's great when the big hits of the past gen get these performance updates, if any games could use it the most, it's the titles that didn't have a huge audience before and could gain a new lease on life with their full potential unlocked. Either way, unlike 8 years ago, The Order 1886 is far less of a risk to try. For a $5, you can get a weekend's worth of assets to ogle at, and some cool guns to play around with, and then you can move on without much of a sting to your wallet. The Order in the game is a self-important organization that uses cutting-edge technology to prop up an aging institution rotting from within. Likewise, The Order the game uses cutting-edge tech to prop up an aging style of shooter. If these resources had been put into the right places, we could have gotten something special, so in a way I guess I'm just as sad playing it nearly a decade later. But rather than because of buyer's remorse, it's now because I'm left wondering about what could have been.